All right, welcome to lesson 9. In this lesson, we're going to be taking a look at Henry Ford, and we're going to be reading an excerpt from his autobiography, which is titled My Life and Work. I bet Henry Ford, if you don't know him as a historical figure, you know the company he started, which is Ford Motor Company, which is obviously one of the largest and most successful automobile or car making companies that has ever existed. Henry Ford was an inventor, he was a business person, and again, he founded the Ford Motor Company. What he's really notable for, and one of the reasons that Ford became such a successful company, was Ford's innovation. And he pioneered the use of what's known as the assembly line. So prior to Ford's invention of the assembly line, cars were generally made they were almost custom made to the order for wealthy people, and they were made by a group of people all at once in a stationary spot. Ford revolutionized that by creating the assembly line where people specialized in one specific job, and the car would move along a prescribed track or route, and as it moved, everyone would do an individual job. So for example, one person would spend all day tightening lug nuts on a wheel, right? Or one person would spend all day putting in spark plugs in the engine, right? And this created a much more efficient way of car manufacturing and lowered costs tremendously, and made the automobile something that was accessible to the middle class for the first time in history. He had other clever ways of reducing costs. Ford was famous for saying, you can have your Model T in any color you like as long as it's black. He only produced black vehicles. Again, that lowered costs. It allowed one spot on the assembly line to specialize in painting, and they didn't have to mess around with different colors, so it was more efficient and kept costs low. Another big part of Ford's business model was paying workers a higher wage than typical. He felt that this was important. In fact, as you read in his document, he thought it was a social justice issue. But it's more complicated than that. He thought it was a smart business move, and he thought it would help him build for long-term success. His competitors were angry about this move because, as we've talked about, they were used to exploiting their workers and paying them as little as possible. But Ford felt that higher wage would help them work harder, stay longer, and be better employees for his company. It's important to note that Ford was not a perfect man. Like many people of his era, he had discriminatory practices. He was a racist, and he didn't hire certain groups of people. For example, he was known to not hire Jewish workers. The document we're going to be looking at when it comes to Henry Ford, as I said earlier, is from his autobiography. And in this book, he essentially explains how he ran his car company. A few notable quotes from My Life and Work that you'll encounter here in a moment that I wanted to point out are this first one here, which you might, as you read, make some connections back to the Carnegie document where Carnegie talks about his beliefs about social Darwinism. So for here, Ford says, quote, "There can be no greater absurdity and no greater disservice to humanity in general than to insist that all men are equal." So Ford definitely, along with Carnegie, was what you would call a social Darwinist. He believed in this idea of survival of the fittest, that certain men, and I say men on purpose because people at this time would have probably believed that only men were capable of succeeding at the level that Henry Ford was at. So that's one quote I wanted to point out. The second quote is here. It says, quote, he says, quote, "A worker should most certainly be permitted to take away from the community an equivalent of what he contributes to it. If he contributes nothing, he should take away nothing. He should have the freedom of starvation." So Ford is essentially saying here that if you're not contributing, like if you don't have a job, you're not contributing to your community, you're essentially you essentially should get no benefit in return from society. So he is a little bit in opposition to Carnegie here. I think Carnegie, while he did believe in social Darwinism, he definitely thought that there was a role for the government and also through philanthropy to take care of impoverished people. well, impoverished people were poor because they were essentially not good enough, not as good as rich people. He believed that they should still be cared for by society. So just a slight difference there between Ford and Carnegie. So I hope you enjoy the document, and I look forward to discussing it with you in class.